Welcome to Top Shelf. My name's David Pierce, and this week we're looking at two really old technologies that have both found new life again. Virtual reality and 3D have both been tried before, and they both kind of failed, and they were relegated to theme park rides and weird B movies you probably don't want to see. But both are back. Both are being called the future, and both are being pushed by the movie industry, the video game industry, and everybody else as the thing you're going to have next. But are they? We've set out to find out. 3D movies and virtual reality seemingly have nothing to do with each other, but they followed surprisingly similar paths. Both have been mostly confined to novelty uses, like the snake that jumps out of the screen at you at Honey, I Shrunk the Kids at Disney World. And virtual reality has basically just been for video games and sex scenes in sci-fi movies.
More recently, though, both have made a move toward the mainstream, and they've been tapped to do roughly the same thing, even. Make our movies, games, and the whole digital world much more immersive. Both are even designed to replicate how it is we see the world. Take 3D, for instance. When you look at the world through your actual eyes, they see two slightly different pictures because your eyes are set apart. Your brain meshes them into one, which is how you perceive depth accurately. That's also why catching a ball with only one eye open is really hard. 3D cameras do the same thing. They shoot with two lenses and essentially capture two images that they then project into your separate eyes. You use either anaglyph glasses, where one eye sees a red image and the other sees blue, or polarized glasses, which pick up light being projected in two different directions and pipe them into each eye. There's also active shutter 3D, auto stereoscopic 3D, which is just a fancy way for saying the screen does all the work and you don't need glasses, and plenty of other options. They all rely on your brain to take two distinct images and turn them into one. 3D hasn't really caught on though, at least not among consumers and everyday people. It's difficult and expensive to do right, it still requires that you sit with your head very still and at a very particular angle, and there are a huge number of people for whom it either doesn't work at all or actually makes them sick. The technology is still changing, and it's going to continue to improve. But here's the thing, virtual reality might eat 3D's lunch before it ever gets a chance. Virtual reality's also been around forever. It's also been gimmicky for most of that time, and is only recently threatening to become something we use in our day-to-day lives. On one hand, it has a lot of the same limitations as 3D. You have to wear a thing connected to another thing, and it can be really disorienting for some people. But when done right, virtual reality brings the immersion to an entirely new level. It's all about exploration. Good virtual reality creates a three-dimensional world that doesn't just appear to have depth. It has depth. An object will look different depending on how you look at it, and you can even see it from the back. You can't do that with a 3D camera.
Basically, virtual reality works by tricking what are called place cells in our brain. These cells are what orient us in a new environment. They're how we figure out where we parked or even get around our house. And surprisingly, once we're in a new environment, these cells make it really easy to figure out where we are, even if we've been there just a short time.
But virtual reality has its own complications and challenges. For this reality to feel real, there has to be zero latency. When you turn your head, you need to be looking to the side exactly as fast as you expect. Any lag takes you out of the experience, and the effect as it catches up can be so disorienting that you can actually get sick. And these place cells need information like smells and temperature to really give you a full sense of where you are. Both 3D and virtual reality are still maturing, but they're both moving towards the same goal. We want our movies to feel like video games and our video games to feel like real life. Can virtual reality bring the change 3D promised? And just how far into the matrix can we really go?
Joining me now to answer all of my many questions about all of this is Frank Rose, the author of the book The Art of Immersion and a longtime contributing editor at Wired. He's also fresh off his first experience with the Oculus Rift. So Frank, thank you for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So real quick, just like 30 seconds, Oculus Rift, what do you think? Is it the greatest thing you've ever seen?
I'm still gripping the table.
Yeah, yeah. You did the coaster and you were like,
yeah.
You go over the ledge and it's like, oh God, I'm gonna die.
Yeah,
It's very intense. Okay,
right.
So I want to start with, I don't know, 60 years ago, really. So 3D movies are not new at this point. They're old. They've been around for forever. And I always thought they were sort of, kitschy things at, Disney World, but they weren't. They were movies. So what happened years ago and why didn't it work?
Well, basically it didn't work because it was all analog. And, the thing about digital, one thing about digital, it's very precise. You can get things to line up very precisely. When you're 3D is basically just you're looking at two images at once and they have to line up. If they don't line up, you're going to get a serious headache at best.
And it's even like the slightest bit off that just totally throws everything off.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. In fact, almost the closer it is, if it's not exactly on, the worse it gets.
Right.
So along comes James Cameron, 10 years or so ago, fresh off Titanic, and he decides he wants to reinvent 3D for the digital age. And at this point, it's much easier to do because, you know, with digital technology, you can line things up exactly. It's still, however, it's very difficult in that you have to go to incredible lengths to reproduce an effect that we actually see quite naturally.
You mean just like a thing and then another thing right behind it?
Yeah,
Doing
exactly.
that is much more difficult than it seems, right?
Yeah, I mean, seeing you know, actual objects in you know, in a depth field is quite easy for about 90% of people, but mimicking that experience on film is very, very hard, and you know, remains so to this day. I think Cameron, obviously very serious about it, and an extremely brilliant director.
And kind of had, you know, all the money in the world to do whatever he wanted at this point. He made Titanic, and they were like, all right, do whatever. Exactly,
exactly. So he goes off with a sort of camera expert named Vince Pace, and they spent several years. They developed the stereoscopic camera. And I actually met him when he was in, I think, 2006. He was on a soundstage in Montreal where somebody else was shooting the first feature film to be shot, you know, using this camera.
It was Journey, right?
Yes, Journey 3D. Mm-hmm. And
was the movie actually called Journey 3D?
I think so.
That's great. We're like, it's in 3D, just in case you didn't know.
Right,
it's in 3D.
Exactly. So, you know, so I get a chance to talk with Cameron about all this. And what he said basically was that the whole point of 3D for him is to remove what he calls the screen plane, which in a normal movie, the screen plane is just the screen. But it actually becomes sort of a barrier between the audience and the experience, and especially in 3D. So that's what he sets out to do. And the point of it is to create an experience of depth, something that can, you know, really draw you into it. And, you know, he knew how to do this very, very well.
Right.
For most directors, the easy, you know, sort of cheap shot thing to do is to have something come out at you, you know, a sword, a snake, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
And
the thing at Disney World, I remember, it was like a snake that came out and bit you and terrified small children.
Yeah, right, exactly. Or a hand, or, you know, anything like that. But you know, so it really comes down to a question of what are you going to do with it, and how sophisticated is your understanding of how to make it work.
Because again, it's really small, and we've seen this even in the sort of digital era as we've gone to it, is some people do 3D really big, and that seems to cause problems, and some people do it really small, and that seems to cause problems. And there's like this sweet spot that, you know, a couple of movies, I think Avatar got a lot of credit for doing it right, and Life of Pi got a lot of credit for doing it right. But a lot of other movies, people still seem to think 3D is like, it's either it doesn't work or it's not really that useful. But that's really the question, like, is it, I guess, done well, is it useful? There seems to still be this huge debate. Like, what's this in service of other than charging me $5 more at the movie theater?
Well, don't underestimate that.
True.
You know, I think, you know, done well, but that's a very big caveat.
Yeah.
You know, done well, it can create an incredibly immersive experience. But the thing is that, you know, very few people do it well.
So is it immersive just in that it looks more like real life? It looks more like, you know, if I'm looking at the world of whatever, Pandora and Avatar, it looks more like it would if I were actually there. Is that the effect here? That's what we're going for?
That's certainly the goal.
Okay.
That's certainly the goal. You know, a lot of what happens too is that people try to, you know, retrofit 2D movies and make them 3D, and that's never going to work.
Right. Yeah. Well, so that's actually an interesting question. Is like, I think 3D has it was the future of everything.
Yeah,
you know, 3D TVs, ESPN was going to do sports, we were going to do movies, everything.
Right.
And it seems like that's been pulled way back. Is that because the technology is not there? Is it because people don't care? Is it because enough people are doing it badly that everybody has a bad taste in their mouth? Like, why is this? It seems like it's possible to do well, right? So why isn't it taking over the world?
It's possible to do well, but it's very difficult. And also, I think the glasses remain a barrier. You know, the fact that you have to wear these glasses, even though they're, you know, they're certainly far better than the glasses you wore in the 50s, it's not good. It cuts down on light. It makes it just sort of cuts into the experience. And again, I think that the idea that you have to go to all of this, sort of extreme difficulty to mimic something that's actually quite natural
right.
Suggests that maybe it's not all that good an idea. Mm-hmm. I don't know. It can be done,
yeah.
But the question is, can it be done well by a lot of people on a mass scale? That remains to be seen.
Right. But so it's interesting that I think people do want something like this, and you found this in your book, the Art of Immersion. It was really, it seemed to me that there were sort of two branches to the book. One was like how people want to interact with stories, and it's like
right.
You had the Mad Men example where people just started tweeting as Mad Men characters,
right.
and it became this whole crazy phenomenon, and people they got shut down, and then they brought it back, and it was great marketing for the show.
Right.
But then on the other hand, it's not only do we want to expand, sort of horizontally integrate these stories with all these other pieces of the world. Mm-hmm. We want the stories themselves to be better.
Right.
Is that a fair way of categorizing it?
Yeah.
Which, we've clearly veered toward the interacting with stories. I feel like that's right. happened. We won that battle against people who didn't want us to do it.
Yeah.
And people are tweeting about shows now, and every movie has a video game and all this stuff. But so what kind of progress have you seen towards this, let's fundamentally change how we tell the story?
Not a great deal. I mean, you're right in that we're certainly moving toward kind of a participatory experience. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I realized when I was working on the book was that every time we come up with a new medium, a new form of a new medium for one of the things I realized when I was working on the book was that every time we come up with a new technology, a new medium for telling stories, it takes people at least 20 or 30 years to figure out what to do with it.
Okay. Yeah.
And with the movies, motion picture camera was invented around 1890. It was 1916 before you had a film that really took all of what we now take for granted as the grammar of cinema. Mm-hmm. All the sort of tricks of the trade, cuts, pans, fades, point of view shots, all of these things had to be invented because before there was a camera, there was no way to even imagine
Sure.
it. And it was another 10 or 12 years after that before you had sound. Right. So with television was invented around 1925. It was the early 50s before you had something that was not just sort of mimicking radio or mimicking stage play. And I think the internet is no different. I mean, we've had the internet now, or we've had the web for 22 years at this point, but we're still figuring out what to do with it. And it's also changing. It's advancing pretty rapidly. At the same time, just as movie technology was advancing rapidly. So it's not really surprising that we should still kind of be in an experimental phase, and I think that's where we are. Mm-hmm. You see things like Lost, for example, which was a TV show that didn't really have all that many aspects that were obviously interactive.
Right.
But it was so complicated that it was a show that's almost impossible to imagine before the web.
That's true. I remember I watched that show religiously, and I remember reading Lostpedia between episodes, and it was like I'd watch an hour of TV, go, what just happened? And then spend the next 6 days like reading through what everybody else was trying to piece together and like how the characters, and it's kind of true. I can't imagine watching that show without having access to all that stuff and all these other people who were watching it as well.
Yeah, exactly. I interviewed the guy who created Lostpedia, and completely fascinating. I mean, this was a Silicon Valley guy. He, knew technology very well. He, binged on the first season, and then when the second season came along, he, was like, whoa, what was that just about? And so he did sort of, what comes naturally to people now, which is, start a wiki as a way of, developing developing the story. The showrunners, they had, I mean, I interviewed them as well. They had somebody on the production whose sole job was to keep track of everything, keep track of all the characters, keep track of what they were doing, what they had done, where they came from, where they were going. On days
Did
when
they have like a Bible of it all that was like Mr. Echo is X, Y, and not Z?
Yeah, exactly.
Then,
and in the they have a big writers' room. So in the writers' room there were sort of giant Post-its that covered 3 walls.
Wow.
Wow. All color coded.
Yeah.
But on days when this guy wasn't there, when he was off or something, the producers would turn to Lostpedia to figure out.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. But so all this seems to be, is this just like a stopgap until we can actually be part of the story? It seems like that's what, George Lucas and Spielberg were talking about this as like the next great step, is like that our movies feel like video games in the sense that I can be part of it and I can control it. And that's something else that's been tried and failed. And you wrote a little bit about this. I forget what the movie was called, but it was, Roger Ebert reviewed it and just said it was the worst thing he'd ever seen. And it was like a movie where you could control the plot.
Right,
Is that
exactly. This was in the early 90s, and so there was a guy who decided that this was going to be the future of movies, and it was a variant on the choose your own ending scenario, which I think is a kind of a primitive example of interactivity and almost inevitably like a wrong path. But especially a wrong path in the context of a movie theater. So he created these not very great movies to start with, and then at certain points in the in the movie, the audience was asked to choose A, B, or C. Which way would the movie go? And they had taken a couple of theaters in New York and LA and sort of tricked them out, replaced the cup holders with buttons, so green, yellow, and red, and you could press a button and decide where the movie was going to go. Except the problem was, of course, you weren't watching it by yourself.
Right.
You were watching it in a movie theater full of other people, or in this case, actually not full of other people.
full of like 2 other people.
Yeah. And so it led to these scenes of pandemonium where people would start leaping over the seats to get to vacant controllers, and it was a complete mess. But the whole point of immersion, we've always had this impulse to immerse ourselves in stories, in fictional stories in particular. If we see a story or read a story, and it doesn't really matter what medium it's in, something that we really identify with, we want to be in that world. At least in our imaginations, and that's been a universal impulse. It has, it's something that has not changed. You can lose yourself in books, and people still do that. Don Quixote, the reason he went tilting at windmills in 1605 in Cervantes' story was because he had lost his mind from reading too much, which was, then a pretty new activity.
And actually is probably completely possible and still doable. But it seems like that's, there's this interesting convergence between those two things, where it's like we still want to lose ourselves in these stories, and we also want to participate in them.
Right.
And that to me is where something like virtual reality becomes really interesting. And I feel like in some sense, I don't know if you agree with this, but I think 3D is sort of, virtual reality is partly 3D. That's part of the technology, but it seems like it's everything 3D is plus all of the other things it needed to be to really be successful. In the sense that not only does it look deep and it sort of looks like it would be as if I'm standing in the world, but it feels that way too. And that's, we've had this around for, not this particular thing, the Oculus Rift, but we've had virtual reality around for forever too, right? So what when you were doing the book and when you were working on all this, did virtual reality come up at all?
It came up a little bit, but at the point when I was working on the book, frankly, it was which was in 2010, 2011.
But that's not that long ago.
Yeah, right, exactly. But even then, it was not really on the radar.
Yeah.
It was something that had been on the radar a long time ago, and was not now. I mean, the people behind the Oculus Rift have done something that's pretty remarkable, which is to bring it back in a credible version. Obviously, technology has moved ahead tremendously since the late 80s, early 90s, which was when you first had all of the hype about VR.
Right. They were like the big headsets you had to like lower down onto your head.
Right.
And yeah, it was terrible.
Right. But now you still have a little headset. So
That's true.
But the thing about it is, it's a very personal experience. It's just you in this world, and so I think there's a lot of appeal for something like that, and it's certainly immersive in the sense that once you're there. If the production is well done, you're really in it. So.
Yeah. I mean, and I think, do you think it's true that this is, is this where we're going next? Are we all going to throw away our 3D glasses and buy virtual reality glasses? Because again, you mentioned the big problem 3D still has is that you have to wear glasses.
Right.
And this is not only glasses, it's big fat goggles you have to put on your head and attach to a PC.
I do think that's problematic. I think that certainly, this will attract a following. How big a following? I really don't know. Will it become one of the next big, interfaces for gaming? That's entirely possible.
Right. Gaming seems like the easy one.
Yeah.
Where it's, just the ability to stand there, because I'm already sitting on my couch, I already have a controller in my hand, and just to be able to go like this is enough of a selling point that I'm probably going to get into this idea.
Right.
But so what about things like, we were talking earlier about Sleep No More and some of these shows that you've been to where, and in a way you sort of said in the New York Times a couple weeks ago that this is, it may be a hint at what the future of movies and video games are like. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's really intriguing. So Sleep No More, of course, is an immersive theater experience where instead of sitting down in a seat and staring at a stage, behind a proscenium arch, you are in the middle of the experience. In the case of Sleep No More, there's a 5-story loft building that you are free to explore, and action takes place all around you sometimes, and sometimes nothing is happening at all. But there's always, sort of like...
and you basically, I haven't been to Sleep No More, but you basically, they give you 3 hours and just sort of open the door and turn you loose, right?
Yeah.
You can just have your own experience however you want to do
Exactly. And, I've been twice, many people have gone a number of times, and you never quite have the same experience twice, because part of it is just serendipity, where you happen to be at any particular time. And it's interactive in the sense that, in some cases you're just sort of watching what's going on around you. In other cases, you're actually kind of brought into the action a bit.
And that's kind of the dream, right? For all for movies, for games, that's what we want. We want to be part of the action.
Right. What it really comes down to is the holodeck, right? Which Gene Roddenberry invented in the so to speak in Star Trek: The Next Generation in the 80s, and kind of remains the ultimate holy grail.
Yeah. It's that and the Minority Report interface seem to be the two things everybody talks about. Is like that's what I want in life.
Right. Now the Minority Report interface is actually fairly simple.
Yeah,
but
the holodeck is not simple.
It's a lot more complicated, and it's the holy grail in the sense that the holy grail was of course something that you were never able to actually attain.
Right.
And so far, that's what the holodeck is. But what really intrigued me about things like Sleep No More is, in a way, it's sort of like the holodeck, except in real life. It's not a virtual experience. It's a real experience. It's a physical experience. And
but it's you mean in the same way as the holodeck, it's very much sort of what you want it to be, and you can create it differently every time you go in.
Exactly.
The holodeck was, it's sort of even a level beyond some of this other stuff where like if you wanted a chair, it could make you a chair.
Right.
And I guess I don't expect, Sleep No More or virtual reality to do that for me, but it did sort of put you in whatever environment you wanted to be in, and it would always feel different.
Yeah, exactly. So on the holodeck, you could ride the Orient Express, you could have a conversation with Einstein, you could engage in a Victorian Gothic romance, you could do any number of different things like this. And in fact, there's a wonderful book called Hamlet on the Holodeck that was written by Janet Murray, who was then at MIT and is now at Georgia Tech, in the late 90s, that looks at digital storytelling in a very prescient way. Quite interesting for people who want to explore that further. But so with the holodeck, you could really experience things, but in a completely virtual environment, obviously. But a virtual environment that was completely convincing. You had life-size 3D holograms that had physical presence. You could touch them, that sort of thing. So that's pretty fanciful stuff. We haven't quite gotten there yet.
For now.
For now. Yeah. But something like Sleep No More, you actually are in a room with 3D people,
right. So is there a way to combine any of that stuff? Like, I guess we are a long way away from being able to be convinced by something like the Oculus Rift that we're in a real world, because it's partly about touching, it's partly about being able to smell things and hear things and walk around in a more convincing way. But is that where we're going? Are we going back to adding smell-o-vision onto all of this stuff so we get to the point where it all works?
Well, you could certainly add smell-o-vision to the Oculus Rift, I suppose. It wouldn't be that hard.
Actually.
Yeah, right.
But again, is that what we want? Is that what we're working towards? Is that going to be James Cameron's next big project? Is let's figure out how to get people even more involved in the story? I think
that's definitely where we're headed. I think that's the kind of thing we want. We don't quite know how to get there yet, and the technology isn't quite there, but that's what things like the Oculus Rift are for, is to show us where we can go.
Mm-hmm. So I think my other big question here is it seems like our attention spans are getting shorter. This is the big complaint everybody, every movie maker seems to have, is people don't pay attention anymore.
Right.
But then we're making these things that literally force you to pay attention, where it's like, I can't wear this and do other things. Just like physically, that's not possible.
I don't know. I can see people wearing this and driving. I don't want to be on the road with them.
True.
I'm sure it will happen.
With 3D glasses and driving, that would be a good look. But so is that, are we going to come back to this place where this sort of deeply immersive storytelling becomes so good and so engrossing that it takes over again? Or are we lost forever to Twitter and everything else while we watch TV?
Well, it's funny because they are kind of contradictory impulses, and yet they're clearly both happening at the same time. If you, look at Lostpedia or, the wiki for any TV show. There's not a TV show in existence these days that doesn't have a wiki about it.
Sure.
Look at something like The Walking Dead, which is the most popular show on TV, has thousands, tens of thousands of tweets about it every time it's on the air.
I have to turn off Twitter if I'm an episode behind. It's terrible.
Right. And, has a talk show about it, which is also incredibly popular. So there's clearly a big appetite for immersing yourself in zombie stories, and in that zombie story in particular. So, at the same time that we have, a tendency to skim the surface of things and to, move quickly from one thing to another, if there's something that we want to do a deep dive on, it's there for us to do. When I was talking with Cameron, he, we talked for a bit about Avatar, which at that point was not yet green-lit. It was fairly clear that that's what he was going to do next. But he didn't want to talk about it too much because he didn't want to, at that point, give away the plot and so forth. But he did say that He described it as sort of an Edgar Rice Burroughs action-adventure story. And he said that for him, the best way to tell a story like that was to create almost like a fractal experience, where if you were a casual fan, you could just watch the movie for 2 or 3 hours, and that would be it. But if you were a more committed fan, you could jump in almost in powers of 10, and the pattern would still hold.
Interesting.
And that's what's really happening. You know, with something like The Walking Dead, you know, the more committed you are, the deeper you can go. And I think we're seeing that, you know, across a whole range of TV shows and to a somewhat lesser extent movies at this point. You know, partly these are marketing gimmicks for the properties, but they're also ways to reward fans and to get fans to engage more deeply. And as television loses, you know, more and more of its audience in the sense of, you know, broadcasting is obviously not what it used to be. No. It's becoming apparent that one way to make up for that is to bring people in deeper, to get them more engaged and more committed to a show, to a story. And I think this is one reason you see all this happening.
Awesome. Well, Frank Rose, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you taking the time. So whether or not virtual reality is the future of video games and movies is definitely still under debate. But one thing it's already being used for is in the medical field and all sorts of other places that you may not have expected. So we decided to explore some of the other places virtual reality has been used for a long time and might really be the future.
Virtual reality's whole appeal is how immersive it is, how real it feels. That's great for playing games and watching movies, but this crazy, intense experience is already being used for much more than that. The military is one of the biggest. Virtual reality is used to treat post-traumatic stress disorder for veterans, allowing former soldiers to relive some of their most frightening experiences, but in a safe environment. It feels every bit as real, but it's presented along with therapy and doctors and safety, and the Virtual Iraq program has been incredibly powerful. Virtual reality is also being used to train soldiers and pilots, allowing them to go through their missions before there's real gunfire involved. It's basically Ender's Game in real life. Doctors are using virtual reality to treat addiction or even fear. You strap on the virtual reality helmet, then work up to seeing the exact thing you're afraid of. It's simple, worry-free immersion therapy, and it really does seem to work. We've seen firsthand how affecting virtual reality can be, thanks to the Hunger in Los Angeles experience at the University of Southern California. Verge editor Brian Bishop found himself wearing an Oculus Rift, watching a diabetic man collapse on the streets of Los Angeles, and he couldn't do anything about it. Even with primitive graphics and a big headset on his face, Brian couldn't believe how caught up he was. This stuff works. Being able to explore the world you're in has all sorts of benefits as well. It lets architects walk through the buildings they're creating, lets fashion designers see how their outfits look, or lets doctors explore your MRI in a much bigger and more useful way. It's even letting doctors perform much better robotic surgery. Instead of just staring at a monitor, it's like they took the magic school bus and went inside your body. Virtual reality is an incredibly powerful technology, both for what it can do and for what it can make us think we're doing. Whether or not it's the future of games, we don't know, but there's no doubt it's part of the future in a number of other ways we never even imagined.
And that's it for our show. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks to Frank Rose for being here and for a great interview. We'll be back next Monday and every Monday with lots more to talk about. There's lots more coming this summer, and it's going to be awesome. So stick around. We'll see you next week.